All right, folks, we're going to do the first chapter of the Red Badge of Courage, or at least some of it, to sort of start you off. We can't go through that whole thing and then not actually, do any of the story. I feel like we need to reinforce some of those lessons. So, the Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, Chapter 1. The cold passed slowly from the earth, and the lifting dawn revealed an army stretched across the hill, resting. As the hillsides changed from brown to green, the army awakened and began to tremble with eagerness at the talk of battle. A river, yellow-colored, curled at the army's feet. At night, when the stream had become a sorrowful blackness, one could see across it the red eye-like glow of enemy campfires in the distant hills. Okay, so that's your first paragraph. We're getting exposition here. This is the information dump. We can tell that this is a Civil War story, that it's about armies, that we've got two different armies on different sides of a river, in this particular case, the Rappahannock River, in Northern Virginia. But we have to imply that because it doesn't tell us clearly. But also there's a lot of personification. I don't know if y'all picked up on that. The lifting dawn revealed an army stretched across the hills. That stretch doesn't necessarily personify anything, but it could. It's waking up. When you wake up, you stretch. Maybe there's something there. But the army's resting. An army doesn't rest. Individual people rest, but an army itself, we're sort of using that personified idea of the army as a being. Then we say the army awakened. Can you see this army having human traits and began to tremble with eagerness? So we're talking about the men collectively as a unit, but we're referring to it as an army and we're treating it as a creature. You even get that curled at the army's feet. Now the river is curled like a snake, with the army's feet. That's interesting. But then when you look across, it says, at night, when the stream had become a sorrowful blackness. That's personification too. A stream can't feel sorrow. But we're prepping you for sorrow to come in the story by mentioning it in the very first paragraph. One could see across it the red eye-like glow of enemy campfires in the distant hills. That makes the enemy like a red-eyed monster, something along those lines. Anyway, I don't need to keep talking about it, but these are the kinds of things you can pull out of a story if you want to read and analyze it, and that's what makes it literature. Once a certain tall soldier went to wash a shirt. He came rushing back from the brook, waving his shirt like a flag. He was breathless with a tale he had heard from a good friend. "We're going to move tomorrow, sure," he said importantly. "We're going up along the river, across, and come around behind 'em." To his listeners, he told a loud and careful story of a very smooth battle plan. When he had finished, the blue-clothed men scattered into small arguing groups. "It's a lie. That's all it is, a thundering lie," said another soldier loudly. His smooth face was red and his hands were pushing angrily into his pockets. He considered the matter as a wrong against him. "I don't believe the old army's ever going to move. I've been ready to go 8 times in the last 2 weeks, and we haven't moved yet." The tall soldier felt required to defend the truth of the story he himself had introduced. He and the loud one almost started fighting about it. So we've introduced 2 characters, a tall soldier and a loud soldier. They don't have names yet, but they will get names. But they're identified by a particular trait, and I think that's interesting. It's also interesting the loud one's not the one who told the story in the first place. I think it's also interesting that the soldier who came and told the story about the fight that's upcoming, I'm going to try and make this fit better, is waving his shirt like a flag. We've got a battle image there right off the bat as well. The tall soldier felt required to defend the truth of the story he himself had introduced. He and the loud one almost started fighting about it. There was a youthful soldier. This is going to be our protagonist. We want to pay attention to the way he's introduced. Who listened with eager ears, that's a personification too, your ears can't be eager, to the words of the tall one and to the varied remarks of his friends. After listening to the discussions concerning marches and attacks, he went to his tent. He wished to be alone with some new thoughts that had lately come to him. We get the idea that this young soldier's a thinker. He goes to his tent to be alone so that he can think, probably an introvert. I sympathize. The youth was in a condition of shock. So they were at last going to fight. Tomorrow, perhaps, there would be a battle, and he would be in it For a time he had to labor to make himself believe. He could not accept with certainty a sign that he was about to take part in one of those great affairs of the world. He had, of course, dreamed of battles all his life, uncertain and bloody fights that had excited him with their vastness and fire. In dreams, he had seen himself in many struggles. He had imagined people secure in the protection of his fierce bravery. But awake, he had regarded battles as bloody marks on the pages of the past. He had put them as things of the past with his imaginings of heavy crowns and high castles. There was a portion of the world's history which he regarded as, quote, the time of wars, but it, he thought, had disappeared forever. So this is interesting. Obviously, we just had our initiating event, right? Like, hey, there's going to be a battle, right? Like, that starts our protagonist, our main character. We don't know his name. He's simply the young soldier at this point. Young being his primary trait and thinking being sort of the secondary one. It puts him into a thought spiral about battles and what they're like. And, you know, he had always thought, he seems to think here of battles as something that, you know, regard crowns and knights and castles. Not something that happens in a modern world. And so there's this idea of war and battle and sort of the honorable, chivalrous nature of it in his head, and now he's being faced with the reality of it. He had wanted several times to join the army. Tales of great movements shook the land. There seemed to be much glory in them. He had read of marches, advances, battles, and he had wanted to see it all. His busy mind had drawn for him large pictures filled with breathless deeds. But his mother had prevented him from going. She looked with little favor upon the quality of his war spirit. She could calmly seat herself and give him many hundreds of reasons why he was more important on the farm than on the field of battle. This is an interesting statement connected to one of our themes right off the bat. You know, how important is an individual human being to a battle, to the outcome of a war? Certainly, she's right. He's more important on the farm than he is in this vast number of troops. I mean, how many soldiers did the Union have at the Battle of Chancellorsville? Was it 180,000, something like that? She had certain ways of expression that told him that her statements on the subject came from a deep belief. At last, however, he had taken a firm position. The newspapers, the talk of the village, his own imaginings had excited him to an uncontrollable degree. They were, in truth, fighting finely down there. Almost every day the newspapers talked of victory. One night, as he lay in bed, the winds had carried to him the ringing of the church bells. Someone was pulling the bell rope wildly to tell the news of a great battle. This voice of the people, joyful in the night, had made him tremble with excitement. Later he had gone down to his mother's room and had told her, "Ma, I'm going to join the army." "Henry, don't be a fool," his mother had replied. She then covered her face with a blanket. There was an end of the matter for that night. Nevertheless, the next morning, this is all exposition, right? Like we're finding out about Henry, about his backstory. We now have a name for him. The young soldier's named Henry. Nevertheless, the next morning he had gone to a town that was near to his mother's farm and had joined a regiment that was forming there. When he returned home, his mother was milking a cow. Very agricultural image here. 4 others stood waiting. "Ma, I've joined," he said to her hesitatingly. There was a short silence. "The Lord's will be done, Henry," so she had finally replied, and then continued to milk the cow. When he had stood in the doorway, with his blue soldier's clothes on his back, and with the light of excitement and expectancy in his eyes, he had seen 2 tears leaving their trails on his mother's tired face. Still, she had surprised him by saying nothing about his returning. He had privately been ready for a beautiful scene. This is the romanticism, right? He expected some perfect scene of his leaving and his mother and what they would do. He anticipated it almost like it was a movie. He had prepared certain sentences which he thought could be used to produce great emotion, but her words destroyed his plans. She had steadily cut potatoes and spoken as follows. "You be careful, Henry, and take good care of yourself. Don't think you can beat the whole rebel army at the start, because you can't. You're just one little fellow among a lot of others, and you have to keep quiet and do what they tell you. I know how you are, Henry. And always be careful when you choose your friends. There are lots of bad men in the army, Henry, and the army makes them wild. They like nothing better than taking a young fellow like you, who has never been away from home much and has always had a mother, and teaching him to drink liquor and curse. Stay away from them, Henry. I don't want you ever do anything, Henry, that you'd be ashamed to tell me about. Just act as if I were watching you. If you keep that in your mind always, I guess you'll come out all right. You must always remember your father too, child. And remember, he never drank a drop of liquor in his life and seldom cursed neither. I don't know what else to tell you, Henry, except you must never avoid your duty, child. If a time comes when you have to be killed or do a bad thing, Henry, don't think of anything except what's right. Many women have to endure such things in these times, and the Lord will take care of us all. Don't forget your shirts, child, and try and keep warm and dry. Goodbye, Henry. Be careful and be a good boy. This is her speech to him. Very practical, very real. Nothing about battles and glory and all of that, just about hang out with the right people, don't drink and swear, do what's right, don't forget your shirts, and don't forget that you're a really small guy in the grand scheme of things. That's what his mom seems to say to him. He had, of course, not been patient during the speech. It had not been quite what he expected. He departed feeling a kind of relief. Still, when he had looked back from the gate, he had seen his mother kneeling among the potatoes. Her brown face upraised was marked with tears, and her body was shaking. He had lowered his head and gone ahead, feeling suddenly ashamed of his purpose. I think that's an interesting thing, too. He wanted this to be glorious. He wanted this perfect moment of goodbye, and instead he leaves his mom crying among the potatoes and feels guilty that he's leaving. From his home, he had gone to the school to say goodbye to many friends. They had gathered about him with wonder and admiration. He had felt the difference now between himself and them, and he had been filled with a calm pride. There was a dark-haired girl, at whom he had gazed steadily, and he thought she grew sad at the sight of his blue uniform. And, as he had walked down the path between the rows of oaks, he had turned his head and seen her at a window watching his departure. He often thought of it. There's also this romantic image that he's created. Now he's very different from everybody else simply because he's wearing a blue uniform. What difference does the uniform make? What difference does putting it on make? He impressed this girl that he likes, and he thinks about that all the time. It's showing you his age. On the way to Washington, his spirits had risen. The regiment was fed and praised at station after station until the youth had believed that he must be a hero. As he enjoyed the smiles of girls and was given attention by the old men, he had felt growing within him the strength to do splendid deeds. Now this is the heroism idea, right? What makes somebody a hero? Is it other people's belief? What makes somebody courageous? After long journeys with many pauses, there had come months of boring life in camp, the reality. You think you're going to be a hero, you put on this blue coat. The reality is months of boring life in camp. He had the belief that real war was a series of death struggles with little time for sleep and meals. But since his regiment had come to the field, the army had done little but sit still and try to keep warm. He was brought then gradually back to his old ideas. Struggles, as in ancient times, were ended. Men were either better or more fearful. He had grown to regard himself merely as part of a vast blue display. His main job was to take care of his personal comfort as well as he could. Now, there was a more serious problem. He lay in his tent thinking about it. He tried to prove to himself that he would not run from a battle. All right, so we have this flashback of how he got here. We got all this background information on Henry, and now he's back at his tent, and he's mulling over in his head. He's thinking about whether or not he is going to run when battle comes. He wanted to be a hero. He saw himself as this great heroic figure for joining the military, and now he's not so sure. Before now, he had never felt obliged to consider too seriously this question. In his life, he accepted certain things, never doubting his belief in final success, and thinking little about methods. But here he was, faced with an immediate situation. He had suddenly wondered if, perhaps, in a battle, he might run. He was forced to admit that, in the matter of war, he knew nothing about himself. He's analytical. He thinks about himself this way. He jumped from his bed and began to pace nervously back and forth. "Good Lord, what's the matter with me?" he said aloud. After a time, the tall soldier came into the tent. He began to put some articles in his bag. The youth, pausing in his nervous walk, looked at the busy figure. "Gonna be a battle, sure, is there, Jim?" he asked. "Course there is," replied the tall soldier, whose name was Jim Conklin. This guy gets a name too. So we have Henry, and then we have Jim Conklin. Some critics note that his name is JC and maybe connect that to Jesus Christ. I think that might be a stretch, but we'll see as the story goes on. Of course there is. You just wait until tomorrow and you'll see one of the biggest battles that ever was. You just wait. Do you really think so? Asked the youth. Oh, you'll see fighting this time, my boy, real fighting, added the tall soldier, with the manner of a man who is about to enact a battle for the benefit of his friends. Well, remarked the youth, this story will probably have the same result as the others did. Now, take your history lesson, like the Union has lost all the battles in Virginia to this point. No, it won't, replied the tall soldier. No, it won't. The youth remained silent for a time. At last he spoke to the tall soldier. Jim? What? How do you think the regiment will do? Oh, they'll fight all right, I guess. After they once get into it, said the other with cold judgment. They're new, of course, but they'll fight all right, I guess. Now, I think this is important as well because it tells you it's a new regiment. None of them have ever fought. Clearly, the youth hasn't. It's a regiment of new recruits with no battle experience. Compare that to the Army of Virginia and all the fighting they've done on the other side of the river. Do you think any of the boys will run? Continued the youth. Oh, maybe a few of them will run, but there's that kind in every regiment, especially when they first go under fire, said the other in a kindly way. Of course, it might happen that the whole regiment might start to run if they met some big fighting at the beginning, or they might stay and fight, but you can't depend on anything. Of course, they haven't ever been under fire yet. It's not likely that they'll beat the whole rebel army in one battle, but I think they'll fight better than some, and maybe worse than others. That's the way I see it. Most of the boys will fight all right after they start shooting. He placed great weight on the last 4 words, after they start shooting. Did you ever think that you might run yourself, Jim? The youth asked. On completing the sentence, he laughed, as if he meant it as a joke. The tall soldier waved his hand. Well, he said seriously, I've thought it might get too uncomfortable for Jim Conklin sometimes. If a lot of boys started to run, I suppose I'd start to run too. And if I once started, I'd run like the devil. But if everybody were standing and fighting, well, I'd stand and fight. I would. I know I would. The youth felt grateful for these words of his companion. He had feared that all the other men possessed a great confidence. He was now a little reassured. It's the end of chapter 1. So we've given you some exposition. We know this is the Union Army. We know it's a new regiment that's never fought before. We've met 3 characters, a tall soldier whose name is Jim Conklin, a young soldier who is our protagonist whose name is Henry, and a loud soldier we didn't get a lot of information on in this chapter, but he's going to show up again in the next chapter. We got some good imagery, and we set up the central conflict and the central theme. This is a story that's going to be about courage. The central conflict, at least for the protagonist, is that he's afraid he's going to run away from battle and not be a courageous soldier when the time comes. And we've got this contrast between the romanticized version of war, the kind of war that you imagine in medieval times or in classical times, and war the way it is now. And that's going to be something that is going to come into crisp focus as the rest of the story occurs. I think that's enough for us to leave it right here. If you have any questions, you have any observations you want to write, please let me know. I'm happy to talk about any of this. Thanks.